and welcome to Green Spoon Martyrs Quick Hits, a series on the cannabis industry, everything you need to know in the space. My name is Nick Richards. I am a partner and co-chair of the cannabis practice here at Green Spoon Martyr. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you, Dr. Dave Nichols, for joining us today. We're going to be talking about something a little bit differently than cannabis. We're talking about psilocybin today. And we are really, really excited to have what I believe is the worldwide expert in the subject. With us today, Dr. Dave, we call him. Dr. Dave, how are you today?
Doing well, thank you.
Dr. Dave, tell us a little bit about what you're doing in the psilocybin space.
So, I've been working on psychedelics since I was a graduate student in 1969. So I made the MDMA for MAPS phase 1 and 2 studies. I made the DMT for Rick Strassman studies. I made the psilocybin for all of the Johns Hopkins studies. So I've done a lot of research. I improved the method for making psilocybin. It's been improved a couple more times. But was a consultant for a lot of companies that were starting up, consulted on their chemical synthesis programs. So I basically helped to get the field rolling.
Mm-hmm. And when you say, I have always thought that psilocybin was grown, is that a synthetic psilocybin that you're talking about?
Yes, psilocybin is the most active component in so-called magic mushrooms. But, and people, of course, have eaten magic mushrooms for millennia. But if you want to make a drug that can be approved by the Food and Drug Administration, generally they want it to be absolutely pure, well-characterized, and it's much easier to make it synthetically than it would be to grow tons of mushrooms and extract them and purify the psilocybin.
What does it take? And so what I'm hearing is that you have done that with a number of different psychedelics. What does that take? What do you do?
Most of them are pretty easy to make. They're just a couple of chemical steps. You have to be able to get the chemical precursors. Those are commercially available. So for psilocybin, you start with the material that's called 4-acetoxyindole. That's commercially available. And then there are 3 or 4 steps depending on whether you want to make psilocin or psilocybin. So the chemical steps done in organic solvents, some hazardous chemicals, but it's pretty standard chemical manufacturing processes.
Interesting. And Dr. Dave, tell me why psychedelics? What's the interest for you?
So I was interested in psychedelics for a long time, and I had grants to study psychedelics from the National Institute on Drug Abuse when I was a professor at Purdue. And it concerned me that the early work on psychedelics had shown great promise. There were 1,000 papers published describing treatment of about 40,000 patients with mostly LSD. And they had some pretty dramatic results in treating people with alcohol use disorder, end-of-life patients. And that all stopped with the Controlled Substances Act in 1970. The last study of psychedelics stopped, I think, in 1976 or 77. And I would go to scientific meetings and talk to colleagues and say, boy, it's really a shame nobody's doing any clinical work, because that's really exciting stuff. And I worked with rats and cats and rabbits, but I couldn't do clinical studies because I didn't have an MD degree. And they'd say, yeah, it's really tough. It's really tough. And I'd say, you could do it. You just won't get the government to fund it. The government still isn't funding any research in psychedelics, not to any significant extent. And so I went home after one of those meetings. After the umpteenth time, I'd been telling people you need an endowment of $1 million, and then it got to $2 million. Eventually got up to you need an endowment of $10 million from private philanthropy. And I went home after that meeting, and I remember sitting down thinking, you've been telling this story over and over and over, and each time it takes more and more money, and you're going to be 80 years old sitting in a rocking chair, and nobody's going to have done this. So I called up some colleagues that I knew were interested, and I knew a lot of scientists who had gone through the turbulent 60s and had experimented with LSD. And they always thought these things were very interesting to study from a neuroscience perspective. And so I put together a group of colleagues, MDs and PhDs, and we started the Hefter Research Institute in 1993. And we funded the early studies using psilocybin to treat the end-of-life disorder and the studies to treat depression. Mm-hmm. So once we started getting an early read on those results, it was clear that psilocybin was very efficacious in treating end-of-life depression and anxiety, and also for alcohol use disorder. So we really started what's now become what people call Renaissance in psychedelics. We actually really promoted the use of psilocybin. We had a discussion about what we should use for the drug, because we could use MDMA, psilocybin, LSD, mescaline, we could use all of them. We went through the list of them, and I said, no, for treating end-of-life patients, you don't want to give them MDMA because it stimulates their heart and blood pressure, so that's not good. You don't want to use LSD because there would be so much social pushback if we were giving LSD to dying patients, and we thought that wouldn't work. Plus, it lasts a long time. And then mescaline, it lasts a long time too, but it's not very active, and a lot of people get nauseous and throw up, so you don't want to give sick people mescaline. So we settled on psilocybin, which had a long history of use in South America, for example, as in magic mushrooms. And then we tried to rehabilitate the word psychedelic, because in scientific circles, everyone called these hallucinogens. And when we set up the Heffter Institute, we said, well, we're going to study psychedelics. And we were counseled by some pretty big poobahs that you don't want to talk about using psychedelics. People will think you're a bunch of hippies. But we said, no, they're not hallucinogens. They don't produce hallucinations. They reveal aspects of the mind. So we really rehabilitated the term psychedelic. So we were kind of pioneers in getting this field ramped up.
So you say they're not hallucinogenics.
Yeah.
That's a common belief about them, though, isn't it?
It's a common administration legalese definition. Mm-hmm. In the beginning, they were called psychotomimetics, which means to mimic psychosis. Mm-hmm. They don't mimic psychosis or schizophrenia. And then they were called hallucinogens because people say, oh, they produce hallucinations. But a hallucination is something you see that you can't distinguish as being unreal. It looks completely real. And they don't typically do that either. Psychedelic was a term coined by Humphrey Osmond, which means mind manifesting or mind revealing. So they bring out properties of the mind that you normally don't see in conscious awareness. So they're really psychedelics. The hallucinogen is kind of a pejorative term. The government and DA like to use it because it implies that they have negative effects. But we're trying to emphasize the positive. These things have been shown to have remarkable therapeutic effects in depression, anxiety, end of life. The 1 or 2 treatments can treat depression for a year, whereas you have to take a standard medication like Prozac every day for the rest of your life. So they're really proving to be very dramatic in terms of treating a variety of conditions.
What do those treatments look like?
Typically, what you do is you counsel the person beforehand with a team of usually two therapists, although they're looking now at group therapy. But initially, you spend anywhere from 6 to 9 hours discussing relevant issues, talking about relationships. What have you accomplished in your life? What were your goals? Do you have a close relationship with your children? The general exploration of what your life has been. Then the actual treatment, at least with the classic psychedelics, is to wear eye shades, cover your eyes up, and put earphones on that are playing usually nonverbal music, classical music, beautiful evocative music, and you just let yourself go with the experience. And then you see, you can have memories of childhood, memories of people you loved, all kinds of memories flood back. And it's kind of an experience. Actually, if you have one of these, what would be called a transcendent or mystical experience, they're classified as being ineffable. You can't really describe them. You can talk about, it was the most beautiful thing I ever saw. I thought I was walking with Jesus, if you're maybe a Christian, or I talked with the Buddha, or I saw the Big Bang, the creation of the universe. Really tremendously powerful things. And then when you come out of that, if it's a treatment for depression, the depression is gone in about 80% of the people. If it's end of life, people are in terrible agony and distress when they're dying. And you can take that away completely with the psychedelic. They're not afraid to die anymore. If they've had relationships that were ruptured with friends and family, they want to get back and reconnect with those people and really go back to enjoying the fullness of life. Whereas they've been kind of not been able to do that with the anxiety and pain they've been suffering as a result of facing death.
I have heard that taking a psychedelic will sort of cause a rewiring in your brain a little bit, or open up new channels and new ways to think about things and get you away from those main channels that are causing problems. Is that true? Is that what is going on?
That's kind of a general description. Robin Card-Harris, who is one of the big researchers from Imperial College in London, gave a talk, and they said, well, how does this work? How does this happen? And he saved this last slide, and it had a big red button on it in white letters that said reset. You punch it. He said it's like the Control, Delete, Alt on your computer to reset it. There's some kind of a reset mechanism, and that's of intense interest to psychiatrists right now. A lot of the brain imaging, a lot of the work in psychiatry is doing is trying to understand how this actually happens. What does it do? There are suggestions that it stimulates the growth of new synapses and new neurons. It sort of disables the part of your brain called the default mode network that's kind of your ego that locks everything and keeps you thinking and repeating things over and over. It can kind of dissolve that. And actually it expands connections within the brain. So if we see some of the brain imaging, they show that normally when your brain is communicating, different areas of the brain will communicate kind of sporadically, as if you had a big community of villages that were all talking to each other. But occasionally, then you take a psychedelic and all the barriers break down and all the areas in the brain start communicating with each other. So you have this dramatic increase in global brain connectivity. But they don't know why that is therapeutic. Why does that treat depression or anxiety? And those are big topics now in psychiatry.
Can it be dangerous?
Under the controlled circumstances where these drugs have been given, there is no danger. Psychologically, well, they're probably the safest CNS drugs that are known. But if you have a latent psychosis, that can trigger the psychosis. So all the tests all of the experimental treatments that have been done so far, they've carefully screened the participants to make sure that they don't have any mental illness, they don't have any first-degree relatives with schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. That's a big question, how these will work in people who have some of these disorders. So far, none of the experimental tests have looked at patients like that. So it's not clear whether they would actually trigger the onset of mental illness in some of those patients. But in mentally healthy people, they seem to be pretty safe, and people have taken massive doses without injury. So you really can't overdose with LSD like you could with cocaine or fentanyl or heroin or something like that.
And you say so the right patient, so to speak, is not somebody who has some mental condition, but is suffering from depression or anxiety because of things that are going on in their lives, or
just endogenous depression. That's just spontaneously can occur. Some people just get depressed. At end of life, it's a different kind of distress. It's existential distress. So you kind of know what's wrong there. In some cases, it can be reactive depression where something has happened, where you've lost a child or something. That can cause a reactive depression. But basically, some people just get depressed. It's a huge number of people that suffer from depression. And in those people, there aren't very effective treatments. So these seem to be very good for that.
Let me ask this. So still Schedule I controlled substance, right? I think all of what we've talked about are. Any movement to legalize it beyond what's going on in Colorado and Oregon?
For cannabis, you see a big move for legalization. For mushrooms and psilocybin, Oregon has got an initiative where people can get it and use it in supervised conditions. MDMA is in a pivotal phase 3 trial for PTSD. And in PTSD patients, it seems to be very effective after 2 or 3 treatments along with psychotherapy. If those current trials are successful, as the previous phase 3 trial was, we could probably expect it to be licensed by the FDA as a prescription drug, possibly late 2023, early 2024. That would mean that would not mean anybody could just get it. There would be trained specialists that would use it in the therapy. The other drugs are further behind. Psilocybin has got a breakthrough drug designation in the UK and by the FDA. That's a couple years behind. So we could see in 2025, 2026, that might be approved by the FDA for treating at least 1 or 2 conditions.
Anything that it would be, we have a large adult use market in the cannabis space. Is that a possibility for the psilocybin space as well? I mean, clearly it's already out there going on. Is that somewhere where this is going to head, or is this just going to be a straight sort of a pharmaceuticals, kind of a thing?
It's kind of hard to see because you can get into emotional problems with psilocybin, for example, more so than you can with cannabis. I mean, really potent cannabis can cause panic, anxiety disorder, and people who've never smoked it shouldn't smoke high potency cannabis. Psilocybin is a little bit different. You can have anxiety, panic attacks. Probably if you have someone sitting with you who is experienced and sort of knows what you're going through, you'd be safe taking mushrooms at home under the guidance of someone. Generally, it would probably not be a wise thing to take psilocybin or any psychedelic just by yourself, because you could wander out in the street and just be disoriented and get hit by a car, or go climbing up on the mountain and fall off the mountain. Those kinds of things actually have happened.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit more dangerous than cannabis. It's hard to say where this will evolve. It would take a very enlightened set of regulators probably, and some very specific regulations for these things to ever be out, where you could go into a store. In Calgary, I was up there giving a lecture, and marijuana is legal in Calgary, and you just walk into a store, a dispensary, and buy gummies and cannabis and whatever. I think if it happens with psychedelics, with mushrooms, for example, I think it's going to be a long time. I mean, It's conceivable you might get there, and they might regulate the number of mushrooms you could buy and control the purity, and so they'd sort of know what you were getting. It's kind of like, in Canada, with gummies, a package can only contain maximum of 10 milligrams of THC. Even if you have 2 gummies, then they'd be 5 milligrams each. So if they control the amount of psilocybin in the mushrooms, or control the number of mushrooms you can buy to where it's safe, and you had someone who was experienced and could, sit with you and make sure you didn't get yourself into trouble.
Yeah.
You can see a situation like that where it could evolve over time, but we're not close to that, in my opinion.
Dr. Dave, thank you so much for joining us and enlightening us. There was an age of enlightenment comment there about regulators that I didn't get to make, but I feel like we have been enlightened on this call, so really appreciate that. Once again, Green Spoon Martyr, I'm Nick Richards. We're with Dr. Dave here talking about psilocybin. It's the next emerging industry. It's going to emerge somewhere, I think. Dr. Dave, any final comment that we needed to hear about?
No, just that I started working with psychedelics in 1969, and I never could have imagined we would be where we are now. This is going like crazy. Someone told me a while back that there were 600 different entities in the space trying to make money off of psychedelics. Yeah. So it's really taken off. Of course, we'll see attrition, but I think there'll be a few good players, good solid players that develop something that'll be useful. But it's something I could not have predicted even 10 years ago.
It's good news. It's good news. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Dave, and I really appreciate your time. And let us know if something happens. We would love to give some good news out there for the industry, and it'll be really interesting to see, where the cannabis industry goes with the psychedelic industry, if they kind of join in and join forces and move in the same direction or not. So we'll stay tuned on that.
All right. Good talking.
Thank you, sir.
Sure.